The wind carried dust like a veil across the town, whispering through cracks in weathered boards and stirring the horses tethered along Main Street. The morning sun came sharp and white, laying long shadows that stretched like reaching fingers from the saloon to the general store. The town itself held a strange hush, a brittle quiet before voices would rise. Anna felt it cling to her skin as she walked, head bowed beneath the fraying brim of her bonnet. Her shoes struck the boards with a steady rhythm, though she kept her steps light, cautious, as though every sound might call unwanted eyes her way. In the stillness she thought of her own life, the same silence mirrored inside her, heavy and airless. Her world had become measured in small tasks, scrubbing tin pots until her hands burned raw, patching tears in her husband's shirts, preparing meals she scarcely ate. She did not speak much. Words in her marriage were weapons never hers to wield. His voice filled their home like smoke, suffocating but impossible to hold. His anger was rarely thunderous, more often the clipped orders, the sharp pull of her arm, the dismissal in his eyes. And in the gaps between, she had learned to fold herself smaller, to keep the fire low, to let her thoughts wander only when he was gone. At times she imagined a different sky above her head, wide and forgiving. But those were thoughts she locked away, fragile as glass. When he came to her that morning, the smell of whiskey still clinging to his breath, she knew something was different. His grip on her arm was rougher than usual, his eyes gleaming with a cruel determination. He did not explain, not at first. He only pulled her toward the door, muttering under his breath about debts and a man's rights. She stumbled after him, her bonnet slipping sideways, the boards of the porch striking hard against her shins when she resisted. He yanked her hair, sharp enough to wrench a gasp from her throat, and in that moment the truth broke over her. He was not dragging her to church or to the fields. He was dragging her to be rid of her, to sell her as if she were no more than the plow horse tethered out back. The street blurred before her as he dragged her along, the hem of her dress gathering dirt, the sting of grit between her teeth when she tried to call out. People turned to watch. Faces leaned from doorways, voices dropped to murmurs. The blacksmith, pausing with hammer in hand, glanced once then looked away. Two women in stiff cotton dresses pressed their heads together and whispered, eyes sharp as needles on her bowed figure. Anna felt each stare as though it pinned her to the boards, stripping her of even the pretense of dignity she once held. By the time they reached the open square, a crowd had already begun to form. Children clustered behind their mothers' skirts, men leaned against posts with arms folded. Her husband dragged her to the low platform used for town gatherings and pushed her forward with a shove that nearly sent her sprawling. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a slicked mustache, looked startled at first, then grinned with a kind of oily enthusiasm. "Well now," he said loudly, his voice carrying, "it seems we've got ourselves a different sort of trade today." Anna stood frozen, her knees weak. Her hair had fallen loose around her face, strands clinging to the dampness of her cheeks. She tried to catch her breath, but every inhale burned her lungs, heavy with the dust rising from the square. She could hear the crowd shifting, voices rising in disbelief, laughter, disgust. Some men hooted as if the spectacle amused them. Others muttered about shame and sin. The women's eyes cut into her, filled with judgment sharp enough to wound. But no hand reached out, no voice rose in her defense. Her husband held her upright by the elbow as the auctioneer raised his hand. "A strong woman," he called. "Knows her place in the home, quiet, obedient. Who'll start the bidding?" Laughter rippled again. Anna closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she tried to will herself elsewhere, into the fields where once she had picked wildflowers as a girl, or beneath the cottonwoods by the river where the sound of water once seemed endless. But the murmur of voices, the shifting of boots, the heat of humiliation pressed too close to escape. A man near the front called out a number. Another barked higher, half mocking. Each bid cut through her, a piece of her humanity sliced away. She tasted blood where she had bitten the inside of her cheek to keep from crying aloud. Her husband stood smug, his chest puffed, as though pride rather than desperation drove him. She thought in that moment she might collapse and never rise again. And then a different voice. Low, steady, without flourish. It cut across the noise not with volume but with weight. "I'll take her." The crowd hushed, the laughter faltering. Anna opened her eyes. A figure stepped forward from the edge of the gathering. He was tall, shoulders broad beneath a worn duster, his hat shading his face from the sun. Dust clung to his boots, the mark of long rides across the prairie. He moved without haste, yet with a surety that made people step aside as he passed. When he reached the platform, he removed his hat, revealing dark hair damp with sweat, eyes steady as they lifted to her. He did not leer or smirk. His gaze met hers and she felt something shift, a recognition not of ownership but of seeing, truly seeing. His voice came again, simple, stripped bare of pretense. "You need money," he said to her husband, his tone even, not unkind. Then his eyes returned to her, softer now. "My child needs a breast. And I need love. And a wife." The words hung heavy, almost strange in their honesty. Some in the crowd laughed nervously, uncertain how to take them. Others murmured, scandalized by his boldness. But the man stood still, unflinching, as though the entire town had ceased to matter. Anna could not speak. Her throat closed tight, but her heart pounded with a rhythm she could not deny. She searched his face for mockery and found none. There was no pity either, only a kind of solemn clarity, as though he had measured his words and meant every one. The silence stretched until it seemed to press against her ribs, until her husband's scoff broke it. He spat to the side, grumbled about taking what he could get, and thrust her arm toward the cowboy. The crowd muttered again, but no one stopped him. No one reached for her. She stumbled as her husband pushed her forward, the sting of his fingers lingering on her skin. The cowboy reached out, not to seize her but to steady her, his hand gentle at her elbow. The difference struck her like a blow. For the first time that day Anna stood without swaying. Her husband turned away, pocketing his coins with a smirk, and the auctioneer called for dispersal as though the spectacle had ended. But Anna's world had shifted, though she scarcely understood how. The town still watched, eyes full of judgment, whispers curling in the air. Yet beside her stood a man who had spoken not of possession, but of need, and in his words, she had heard the faintest echo of her own yearning. The cowboy guided her gently down from the platform. He did not press her forward but matched his steps to hers. The crowd parted slowly, eyes clinging to them both, until the street widened before them, open and blinding beneath the high sun. Anna walked with him, each step trembling yet strangely lighter, as though the dust that clung to her hem no longer held the same weight. At the edge of town, where the noise of gossip faded and the prairie wind carried only the rustle of grass, she lifted her eyes once more to the sky. It stretched vast and endless as it always had, but something inside her had shifted. She did not know yet if it was safety or danger or something far between. All she knew was that for the first time in years she had not been silenced by another's command, but startled into breath by a stranger's quiet truth. And that truth, however strange, carried her forward, step by step, into the waiting horizon. The land outside town spread open like a great, waiting silence. The prairie grasses shifted with the wind, bending and straightening again as though whispering secrets to the horizon. Anna rode beside the cowboy on a wagon that rattled with every rut in the dirt road. She did not speak, nor did he. The rhythm of the wheels filled the air between them, steady and unhurried, like a heartbeat that asked for no explanation. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers worrying at the fabric of her dress, yet her eyes strayed often toward him, studying the sharp line of his jaw, the calm set of his mouth. He did not glance at her, only kept his gaze ahead as if the whole world lay waiting just beyond the rise of the hills. When they reached his land, she was struck by its quiet order. The cabin stood plain but sound, timbers squared and roof patched with care. The yard bore signs of work well tended. Tools leaned neatly against the shed, wood stacked by the porch, a small coop of hens scratching in the dirt. Beyond, the field stretched wide, green in patches where the earth had been coaxed into giving. A corral held a single horse, its dark eyes curious as they approached. For a moment, Anna felt her breath ease, as though the space itself allowed her lungs to open after years of tightening against walls and doors. He helped her down, his hand at her elbow again, steady, respectful. She hesitated at the threshold of the house, her body stiff with old instinct, expecting a shove, a barked command. Instead, he pushed the door open and stepped aside. She entered slowly, her senses filling with the scent of wood smoke, leather, and something faintly sweet, dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The room was simple, a table of rough pine, 2 chairs, a small shelf of books worn with use. And near the hearth, a cradle. The child lay within, wrapped in a faded quilt, her tiny face soft in sleep. Anna stopped short. She had not seen a child so small in years, not since she had buried her own before breath had ever truly filled its lungs. The ache of that memory flared sharp, but then the infant stirred, lips parting, and a weak cry spilled into the room. The cowboy moved quickly, bending to lift her. His large hands cradled the child with a gentleness that surprised Anna. He rocked her slightly, murmuring low, and then turned toward Anna. "This is my girl," he said, his voice rough but quiet. She needs more than I can give. The weight of his meaning settled heavy between them. Anna's throat tightened. She reached out, hesitant, and when he placed the child into her arms, she felt the fragile warmth, the soft weight against her chest. The infant nuzzled instinctively, her small mouth searching. Anna's heart twisted, pain, longing, and something else, something like purpose. For a long while she held the child, her eyes fixed on the small face, while the cowboy stood nearby, silent. The moment did not need words. Days fell into rhythm before she could name them. At dawn she rose to stoke the fire, to tend to the child, to sweep the floor and prepare simple meals. He worked the fields, mended fences, rode the land. When he returned, they shared food at the table, his thanks spoken in brief words, never demanding. The silence between them was not the silence she had known before. This silence did not suffocate. It simply lived, like the space between breaths, leaving room for her to exist. Yet her heart was not at peace. When she went into town with him for supplies, the air thickened with judgment. She felt it in the glances that clung too long, in the whispers that rose and fell as she passed. The grocer's wife, lips pursed, handed her goods with deliberate slowness, eyes sharp with unspoken questions. A man at the blacksmith's shop chuckled low, muttering to his companion about the woman bought at auction. The words scalded her ears. She kept her gaze lowered, gripping the handle of the basket until her knuckles blanched. Even in the churchyard, where she thought perhaps mercy might be found, she was met with veiled reproach. The preacher's wife approached her, hand resting too heavily on her arm. "You found yourself in quite this circumstance, dear," she said, her voice sweet and cutting all at once. "I do hope you'll prove yourself worthy of his charity." Anna only nodded, the familiar burn of shame rising in her throat. Later, she avoided the town whenever she could, preferring the quiet expanse of the ranch, though the sting of those words followed her still. The cowboy never addressed the gossip. He carried himself with the same steady calm, neither defending her nor acknowledging the whispers. At first she mistook this silence for indifference. But over time she noticed how he walked a step behind her in the market, his presence a shield. How his hand brushed the brim of his hat politely at the stairs, not in deference but in quiet defiance. His refusal to bow to gossip became its own language, one she began to understand. Evenings often brought the sharp sound of storms across the plains. On one such night, the rain lashed hard against the windows, thunder rolling low like an old restless animal. Anna sat near the hearth, the child pressed close against her chest, the quilt wrapped around them both. The cowboy sat at the table, mending tack by lamplight, his hands steady even as the house trembled. The fire snapped, the child whimpered, and Anna felt the weight of her past press close, a tide of fear threatening to pull her under. She turned to him then, her voice unsteady, breaking the barrier of silence. "I thought I'd never be anything but ashamed," she said. The words came out like a confession, soft yet raw. He set aside his work, lifted his gaze to hers. His eyes held no pity, only a firm gentleness. "Not here," he said. Nothing more. But the words rooted deep. In their spareness, they carried more than any sermon she had heard in town. She felt her breath loosen, her shoulders ease, as though for the first time she might believe she could live outside the shadow of disgrace. The child stirred and fussed, drawing Anna's attention back. She hushed her softly, rocking, her cheek pressed to the infant's fine hair. Yet she felt the cowboy's gaze linger, steady, not invasive but present, and for once she did not shrink from being seen. Time gathered itself into weeks. They fell into a rhythm not of necessity alone, but of subtle exchange. He mended her shawl without asking, the torn hem sewn with neat stitches. She set aside an extra piece of bread at supper for him, placing it without comment. Their hands sometimes brushed at the table, fleeting contact that left a quiet thrum in her chest. Neither spoke of these moments. They built themselves like stones in a wall, unremarkable alone but forming something steady, almost safe, together. Still the outside world pressed hard. One afternoon, while drawing water from the well, she overheard voices beyond the fence, two men passing on horseback. "She'll never be more than what he bought," one muttered. The other chuckled. "A woman's past don't wash clean." The words cut, sharper than any blade. Anna's hands trembled as she carried the bucket inside, the water sloshing cold over her skirts. She said nothing, but the ache gnawed at her, heavy with doubt. That evening, she found herself staring into the fire long after the child had fallen asleep. The cowboy sat across the room, quiet as always, polishing his rifle. The weight of the day pressed on her chest until at last she asked, her voice barely audible, "Do you regret it?" He looked up, his brow furrowed slightly. Regret what? Taking me, she whispered. The shame in her words burned. His answer came without hesitation. No. His tone carried nothing of hesitation, no room for doubt. A man don't regret what's right. She turned away quickly, tears stinging her eyes. She did not want him to see them, though perhaps he already had. That night she lay awake long after the house fell silent, listening to the slow rhythm of his breath in the next room, feeling the faint warmth of the child against her. For the first time, the ache of her shame did not swallow her whole. It loosened just enough to let in the possibility of something else. The days stretched on, filled with small labors, shared silences, and the faint hum of change. Yet beneath the surface, tension stirred, unspoken but near. The town's judgment did not fade, only sharpened, and the memory of her husband's grip lingered in her flesh like an old bruise. Anna sensed that the peace of this place, fragile as it was, could not remain untouched forever. Still, when she rose each morning to the sight of the child's small hand curled around her finger, when she caught the cowboy's steady gaze across the table, she felt the faintest stirrings of strength returning. And with it, the knowledge that silence, once her prison, might one day become her own chosen ground. The air carried the weight of summer heat, thick and heavy as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Anna rose early as she always did, tending to the small fire before the child stirred. The cabin had grown familiar now, its creak of wood, the smell of smoke and leather, the rhythm of footsteps across the floor. She moved through it with a steadiness that surprised her. The woman who had once been dragged by the hair across town felt distant, though her shadow remained, whispering caution in every quiet moment. The cowboy, whose name she had begun to whisper softly when the child dozed, Caleb, worked outside in the corral, the swing of his arms steady as he tightened ropes. Through the open door she could see the flex of his shoulders beneath his shirt, the patience in each movement. He rarely hurried, rarely wasted motion. She had come to recognize in that patience something like strength, the kind that did not need to prove itself with words or anger. Yet peace was a fragile thing. It could be shattered with a single voice, a single step on the wrong road. And one afternoon it was. Anna heard the horse before she saw the man. Hooves beat hard against the earth, stirring up dust, carrying with them a dread she felt deep in her chest. She stepped onto the porch, the child cradled against her hip. Caleb stood already at the gate, his body still, his hand resting lightly near his belt though his weapon remained holstered. The rider slowed, and as the figure came into view, Anna's breath caught. Her husband. His face was red from drink, the veins along his temples standing out like twisted cords. He reined the horse hard, nearly pulling it back on its haunches before sliding down with a stumble. His boots struck the earth with a thud, and his eyes found her immediately. They were the same eyes she remembered, sharp, filled with entitlement, burning with a rage that had not cooled. "Woman," he barked, his voice raw. "You think you can walk off and belong to another? You're mine. Always were. Always will be." The child stirred at the sound, fussing softly, and Anna's arms tightened protectively around her. Her body trembled, old fear rising swift as floodwater. Every part of her remembered the yank of his hand in her hair, the sharpness of his commands. Her feet wanted to step back, to retreat into the cabin's shadows. But Caleb's stillness at the gate held her in place. "I sold her fair," her husband went on, his words slurred but loud. "But a man's right don't end with coin. You hear me?" He spat into the dirt, his gaze cutting from Anna to Caleb. "You got something that ain't yours." Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not move closer, nor did he reach for the gun at his hip. He only said evenly, "She chose to stay." The words hung between them, heavy as stone. Her husband's face twisted, disbelief turning swiftly to fury. He took a step forward, fists clenched. "She don't get to choose." Anna felt the tremor in her knees, the pulse hammering in her throat. For a moment, she wanted to retreat into silence as she always had, to let the men's voices fill the air while she folded small and unseen. But the child whimpered again, soft against her chest, and something inside her shifted. She had been dragged before crowds, shamed, stripped of dignity, but she was standing now, holding life in her arms, on land that had offered her safety. She could no longer pretend her voice had no place. "She does," she said, her words trembling but clear. Her husband's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing. She swallowed hard, but continued, louder this time, each word striking against the years she had swallowed silence. "I do. I choose." The world seemed to pause. Even the wind stilled, the grasses quiet. Caleb's gaze flicked toward her, steady, unwavering, as though lending her strength by standing rooted beside her. Her husband's fury cracked into something darker. He lunged forward, arm lifting as though to strike, but Caleb stepped between them at last. The movement was simple, unhurried. His hand rose, palm open, not grasping, not threatening. Yet his body filled the space with such immovable calm that the other man faltered. Caleb's voice came low, like distant thunder. No more. The silence that followed stretched long. Her husband's chest heaved, his face twisted, but the ground itself seemed to side against him. Anna's eyes locked with his, and for the first time she did not look away. She let him see it, the defiance, the claim of her own life, the fire she had long hidden. "This is my home now," she said, her voice carrying, stronger with each breath. "This child needs me. He needs me. I belong to no one but myself. And I will not go with you." The words left her like a blade drawn free, sharp and irreversible. A murmur of disbelief seemed to ripple in the distance. Anna realized with a start that neighbors had gathered, drawn by the sound of confrontation. Faces lined the edge of the road, watching, whispering, waiting. The gossiping town, the same eyes that had judged her, now bore witness to her claim. Her husband looked around, saw the crowd, and his fury turned desperate. He drew a knife from his belt, the metal glinting in the sun. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Anna's breath seized. But before he could take another step, Caleb's hand moved, fast and sure, the revolver raised and aimed with steady precision. "Don't," Caleb said, his voice low but carrying. The standoff stretched, the knife trembling in her husband's fist, the revolver unwavering. The crowd hushed, the air thick. And then Anna, heart pounding, spoke again. Her voice cut through, not loud but sharp with finality. "Put it down. You will not touch me again." Her husband's eyes widened, not at Caleb but at her. For the first time he saw her not bowed, not silenced, but standing firm. His grip faltered. The knife clattered to the dirt. He spat once more, muttered curses under his breath, and turned, stumbling back toward his horse. When he mounted, it was without the swagger he once carried. His retreat stirred dust that quickly swallowed him whole. Silence lingered, broken only by the rustle of prairie grass and the faint sound of the child breathing against Anna's chest. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring, eyes glancing at her with something different now. Not pity, not scorn, but recognition. She stood tall on the porch, watching the last of them fade, her body trembling but unbroken. Caleb lowered his gun, holstered it with the same calm with which he had drawn it. He turned to her, his gaze steady. No words passed between them. None were needed. He had shielded her, yes, but she had claimed the moment, spoken the truth that could not be taken back. That evening, as the sun sank in a blaze of red across the horizon, Anna sat on the porch with the child in her arms. Caleb worked nearby, sharpening tools, the scrape of metal against stone steady, grounding. The sky stretched wide above them, the first stars beginning to pierce the fading light. She looked out at the expanse and felt a quiet unlike any she had ever known, not the silence of suppression but the silence of peace. Her fingers brushed the child's soft hair, and she thought of the life ahead, not certain but her own. She glanced at Caleb, his profile etched against the dusk, and felt warmth bloom within her chest. It was not sudden fire, not the wild passion of tales whispered in corners. It was steadier, built from shared silences, from gestures that spoke louder than words. A bird lifted from the fence post, wings beating strong, carrying itself into the wide open sky. Anna watched it rise until it was a speck against the stars. Her lips parted and she drew in a long, full breath, her first unburdened one in years. She thought, with quiet certainty, that freedom was not given. It was claimed, step by step, word by word, until the weight of shame fell away. And in that moment, as night wrapped the land in its vast, forgiving embrace, she knew she had begun again.